The icy wind bit at the exposed skin, slicing through layers of clothing as if it were nothing more than paper. The streets were empty, eerily silent, except for the crunch of snow underfoot. It was a night that seemed as though the world itself had frozen, as if nature had decided to stop everything in its tracks. The city, normally filled with the hum of life, now stood still, veiled in white, muffled by a blanket of snow. In the midst of the desolation, there was a figure, a dog, her fur matted with snow, her breath visible in the frigid air. She was a shadow against the white, a small, vulnerable creature, fighting for survival in a world that seemed indifferent to her suffering. Her body, frail and weary, bore a secret, a growing life inside her, hidden beneath a swollen belly, the signs of impending motherhood. The cold was relentless, making every movement a struggle. She was alone, abandoned, her paws dragged through the snow, each step slower than the last. The ice had seeped into her bones, stealing her warmth, draining her strength. Every breath she took was harder, her heart beating with a singular purpose, to protect the lives inside her. The cold, the exhaustion, none of it mattered now. She had to survive, for her pups. She moved cautiously, her eyes scanning the empty streets. She was searching for something, anything, a place to rest, shelter from the winds that tore at her. But there was nothing, just an endless expanse of snow and ice, mocking her. She had once been a dog of joy and warmth, no doubt. Her thick coat would have gleamed in the sun, her eyes bright with the energy of a young life, filled with promise. But now, she was a shell of herself, broken by a world that had abandoned her. Left to wander the streets, desperate for shelter. She was no longer a pet. She was a stray, a casualty of a world too fast to notice those who fell through the cracks. Her swollen belly ached with every movement. She could feel her pups shifting inside her, their tiny hearts beating in rhythm with hers. She had to keep moving, but the cold was unbearable. Her body screamed in protest, each step more difficult than the last. The darkness of the night seemed to close in on her, and she knew time was running out. If she didn't find shelter soon, it could be fatal, for both her and her pups. Suddenly, her legs buckled, and she stumbled, her body giving way for a moment before she caught herself. Every muscle in her body cried out, but she pushed forward, driven by the instinct to protect her babies. She had to keep going. Her survival depended on it. But the cold was too much, the pain too overwhelming. She felt herself weakening, the darkness creeping into her vision. And then, out of the corner of her eye, a light. Faint but there. A car, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon in the night. She froze. The warmth of the vehicle seemed like a distant dream, too far out of reach. She had heard cars before, seen people walking by, but no one had ever stopped. No one had ever cared. But this time, the car slowed as it approached. The tires crunched softly in the snow. The figure inside didn't seem threatening. There was no hurry, no aggression in their steps. The stranger got out, moving toward her with urgency and care. The dog's body tensed. She was torn between fear and the need to trust. Could this person be different? "Hey girl, it's okay," the stranger called, their voice cutting through the wind. "I'm here to help." The dog's ears twitched, and her eyes, wide with exhaustion and pain, turned toward the stranger. She had been hurt before. She had been betrayed. But something in the stranger's voice felt different, gentle, reassuring. Could this be a chance for safety? Slowly, the stranger knelt, extending a hand. The dog, trembling from the cold, hesitated. The air seemed thick with the weight of the decision she had to make. This was no longer just about trusting the stranger. It was about trusting herself, her ability to make it through the night, to protect her pups. Slowly, she moved closer, her steps tentative. She was drawn to the warmth, to the possibility of safety. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she approached. Her strength was fading, but she had enough to get closer to this person who seemed to care. The stranger's hand was now outstretched, ready to help her. "It's okay," they repeated softly, their voice full of tenderness and resolve. "You're not alone anymore." In that moment, as the stranger lifted her fragile form into their arms, the dog allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that she had found something worth fighting for, a glimmer of hope in the coldest of nights. But time was running out, and in the deep cold, every second counted. The warmth of the car's interior contrasted sharply with the frozen world outside. The stray dog, her body trembling from exhaustion and the biting cold, was carefully cradled in the arms of the stranger. Every breath she took was shallow, and her eyelids fluttered as if she were caught between the world of the living and the darkness that threatened to overtake her. The stranger's hand was gentle against her fur, offering a comfort she hadn't known in so long. It was the first touch that had felt kind in months. Her name, if she had one, was long forgotten, erased by the harsh reality of her existence. For the sake of the story, she would be known simply as Luna, a name that seemed fitting for a dog whose life had been shaped by the cold, cruel night. Her fur, once soft and lustrous, now appeared matted and coarse, bearing the brunt of the harsh environment she had been forced to survive in. Luna's past was a shadow, hidden behind the scars of abandonment and loss, but her future, though uncertain, was beginning to take shape in the hands of the stranger who had found her. Luna's journey had begun long before this night. She was once a puppy, born in a small town where warmth and comfort were the norm. She had been part of a family once, curled up in a home with other dogs, the scent of food always present, the sound of laughter filling the air. But something changed, as it often does in the world of strays. Perhaps it was an unforeseen move, a change of circumstances, or simply a moment when Luna was forgotten, lost among the crowds of a busy city. One moment she had been a cherished pet, and the next, she was nothing more than another stray wandering the streets. But Luna's struggle had only just begun. As the years passed, she learned to navigate the streets, seeking food wherever she could find it, hiding from the dangers of traffic and hostile people. Each night, she curled up in a forgotten alley, beneath a dumpster or in the shadow of a storefront. There was always the ever-present threat of cold, hunger, and the cruelty of humans, who had no regard for her survival. But she persevered, as many strays do, surviving one day at a time. Her fur had grown thicker, her instinct sharper. She was no longer the playful, carefree pup she had once been. The world had taught her harsh lessons, and those lessons had hardened her, built a wall between herself and the world she could no longer trust. In the years she had been abandoned, Luna had learned to rely on herself and her instincts. Yet, even in her solitude, there was something undeniable, a maternal instinct that had awakened in her when she realized she was carrying new life. Her pregnancy, though a sign of hope, was also a burden. The additional weight of her unborn pups made every step more difficult. The hunger gnawed at her stomach more than ever before, and the harsh cold made every movement feel like an effort of willpower. Luna knew that her survival was no longer just about herself. She had a responsibility to those growing inside her. The city had become a dangerous place for a pregnant dog. The snow had fallen steadily for hours, the temperature dropping to levels that would have been unbearable for any living creature. The streets were empty. The few humans that had ventured out had long since retreated to the warmth of their homes. But Luna had no home, no place to retreat to. She was left to face the cold alone, her belly swollen with life, her body growing weaker with each passing hour. She had tried to find shelter. She had ventured into alleys where she had known warmth before, only to find them empty, void of anything that could help her. She had searched through abandoned buildings, trying to find any semblance of safety, but each place she visited seemed colder and more desolate than the last. The cold was creeping into her bones, her paws frozen against the hard, icy ground. As the hours stretched on, Luna began to lose hope. She could feel herself growing weaker, the cold making it more difficult to breathe, to move. Her belly, heavy with the life of her pups, seemed to pull her down, and every breath was a battle. But even as the world around her grew colder, Luna's heart burned with one desire: to protect the lives she carried inside her. She had heard stories of kind people who rescued strays, stories of the good in the world that still existed despite everything. But in Luna's experience, those stories were just that, stories. People passed her by every day, indifferent to her suffering, too busy with their own lives to notice the silent cry for help from a creature who had once known love and warmth. She had lost faith in those who walked past her without a second glance, those who ignored the desperate eyes of a dog in need. But this night, as the cold bit deeper into her soul, something shifted. The car that appeared on the horizon was unlike any other vehicle Luna had seen. It slowed as it neared her, the headlights cutting through the darkness like a beacon of hope. A stranger stepped out, their figure outlined by the faint light from the car. Luna's instinct screamed at her to stay away, to hide from yet another human who might offer only rejection or worse. But there was something about the stranger, a gentleness in their movements, a sense of urgency that spoke to Luna's own desperation. The stranger did not rush toward her with aggression or fear. They knelt down slowly, extending a hand in invitation, as if to say, "I am here to help." Luna hesitated. Her body trembled, but it wasn't just from the cold. It was from the weight of trust that she had long since abandoned. Could she trust this stranger? Could she allow herself to believe that someone might finally care enough to help? The stranger's voice, soft and steady, broke through her hesitation. "Hey girl, it's okay. I'm here to help." Their voice carried the warmth of reassurance, a promise that was hard for Luna to resist. Luna's body, drawn by an instinct that transcended fear, took a tentative step forward. Her paws crunched against the snow as she moved closer to the stranger, her breath coming in short gasps. The moment was fragile, the outcome uncertain, but in that one brief instant, Luna allowed herself to believe, for the first time in what felt like forever, that help might actually be possible. Luna's body trembled as she took a cautious step toward the stranger, her tired eyes flickering with uncertainty. The snow around her whipped through the air like icy daggers, but something about the stranger's stillness and gentle voice made her feel a flicker of hope. The harsh winter was unforgiving, but here, in this moment, there was warmth, if she could trust it. For so long, Luna had wandered alone through the bitter cold, her body worn from the streets and struggles she had faced in silence. But this moment, this strange invitation, offered a different kind of warmth, one that reached deep into the heart. The stranger, kneeling on the cold ground, seemed to understand the weight of the moment. Their outstretched hand was inviting, not demanding. They did not rush her, did not force her closer. Instead, they gave her the space to make the choice. For a moment, Luna hesitated, torn between the safety of her instincts and the hope that this stranger could be different. They were not the first to cross her path, but there was something in their eyes that felt different, something that stirred her weary heart. Luna's breath came in shallow gasps, her swollen belly making every movement a challenge. She had been surviving on the fringes for so long, and now, as her pregnancy neared its end, the pain and exhaustion were unbearable. She had been alone for too long, but the growing life inside her pushed her forward, urging her to keep moving despite the cold that seemed to seep into her very bones. With each step she took, Luna's body ached more. Her paws sank into the snow, and the weight of her pregnancy made her movements slow and labored. But despite the exhaustion, her instincts urged her to keep going, to trust in this stranger. Slowly, inch by inch, Luna moved closer to them, the stranger's quiet encouragement guiding her forward. She could feel the warmth radiating from their presence, and it was a warmth that spoke of safety, of care. It was the kind of warmth she had not known for so long, the kind that whispered of the possibility of survival. As Luna reached the stranger, she stopped, unsure of what to do next. Her body was too weary to go any farther, and the contraction pains were starting to grow stronger. She could feel her baby stirring, pressing against her side, and a deep, primal urge to protect them rose within her. But before she could react, the stranger gently placed a hand on her back. It wasn't the hurried, forceful gesture she had become accustomed to. It was soft, careful, and full of understanding. The warmth of the touch spread through her body, like a balm. For a brief moment, Luna closed her eyes, allowing herself to feel safe, something she had not experienced for so long. The stranger's hand remained steady, offering a silent reassurance, and for the first time in a long while, Luna felt the fear begin to ebb away. The stranger's voice, low and soothing, murmured words of comfort, though Luna did not understand them. It didn't matter. The tone was enough: kindness, patience, and a willingness to help. Luna's tired body leaned slightly into the stranger's touch, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to rest. Her muscles relaxed, and the intensity of the pain began to lessen, if only for a moment. The cold no longer felt as oppressive, and the snow, while still falling heavily around them, seemed distant. It was as though the world had narrowed down to just her and this stranger, who had chosen to step into her world and offer a hand when all others had turned away. As Luna caught her breath, she noticed the stranger's eyes flicker with concern. They looked down at her swollen belly, and Luna could feel the tension in the air shift. She could tell that they knew. She was in labor, and the time was drawing near. The realization seemed to weigh heavily on the stranger, and Luna could feel their urgency building. It wasn't just a matter of offering comfort now. It was about getting her to safety. Luna's time was running out, and the journey ahead would be fraught with danger. The stranger's hands moved with purpose now, lifting Luna carefully, guiding her toward the car that was parked just a short distance away. Luna's body was reluctant to move, her legs weak from the strain of the journey. But the stranger was there, supporting her every step of the way, ensuring that she didn't falter. Each step felt like an eternity, but slowly, they made their way to the vehicle. Luna was placed gently inside, and the warmth of the car enveloped her instantly. It was a stark contrast to the biting cold she had just endured. Her body shivered from the shock of the warmth, and for a moment, she was unsure whether to trust it. But the stranger remained by her side, speaking to her in soft tones, reassuring her that everything would be okay. They removed the remnants of her tattered collar, offering her a bowl of water, which Luna drank eagerly. She was parched, her throat dry from the cold, and the water felt like a small oasis in the desert. But it wasn't just her thirst that the stranger was addressing. They could see the signs, the contractions, the trembling of her body, and they knew that Luna's time was rapidly approaching. Her pups would need help, and the cold had already taken its toll on the mother's fragile body. They could not afford to waste another minute. The road ahead was treacherous, the snow blurring the path, but there was no turning back now. The stranger's determination set in, and they began the drive, the engine purring steadily as the car sped through the snowy streets. Luna, exhausted and in pain, tried to settle in the warmth of the car. The ride felt long, longer than it should have, but the stranger's presence was constant, offering comfort through every jolt of the car and every wave of pain that passed through Luna's body. She was not alone anymore. She was in the care of someone who had chosen to help her, chosen to be her lifeline when the world around her seemed indifferent. As the car drove through the night, the stranger's eyes remained focused on the road ahead, but their mind was on Luna. They could hear her soft whimpers, feel the tension in the air as she struggled through each contraction. The pups inside her were coming, and the stranger had to get her to safety. They had no idea what challenges lay ahead, but they knew one thing. Luna wasn't walking this road. The storm outside howled with a fury that seemed to echo the chaos inside the car. Snowflakes whipped across the windshield like a torrent of white arrows, the harsh winds making the road nearly impossible to navigate. The world beyond was a blur of swirling white, and yet, in the back seat, Luna's cries were clear, piercing the thick air with a sound of pure anguish. The pregnant dog's body was stiff with pain, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. Every few minutes, she let out a soft whimper, her body shaking violently with the intensity of each contraction. Luna was in labor, and it was a race against time. The stranger, gripping the wheel with white knuckles, could see the terror in her eyes through the rearview mirror. Her face was a mix of pain and exhaustion, but there was something else there too, a quiet determination. She had fought so hard to survive in the freezing streets, and now, her struggle had taken on a new, more desperate form. Luna's suffering was palpable. Each breath seemed to cause her more pain, but she pushed forward, unwilling to give up. The stranger, a complete stranger to Luna, had promised to help, but now, as they drove through the storm, the fear that they wouldn't make it in time clawed at their chest. The puppy's survival, her survival, depended on this moment. The stranger glanced at Luna through the rearview mirror again, noting the pain on her face, the way her body trembled under the weight of each contraction. She was more than just a stray dog now. She was a living being, struggling against the elements and the pain in her body to bring new life into the world. The stranger knew the odds were stacked against them. The storm was showing no signs of letting up, and every minute they spent on the road felt like a minute lost. The shelter was still miles away. They didn't know if Luna could make it. The wind outside battered the car, pushing it back and forth in the snowdrift-heavy road. The stranger gripped the wheel harder, the tension building in their body as Luna whimpered behind them. The sound of her distress was almost unbearable, but there was no time to lose. They couldn't stop, not now. The shelter they were racing towards was miles away, and they had no guarantee that they would reach it in time. Luna's cries became more desperate, louder. The contractions were coming faster now, each one stronger and more painful than the last. The stranger looked at her in the rearview mirror again. There was something so deep in her eyes, something that spoke of endless struggles, of a life of hardships she had endured alone. And now, as a pregnant mother, she was about to give birth in the coldest, most unforgiving storm she had ever faced. The stranger's mind raced as they drove, each thought more frantic than the last. Would they make it? Was this their final chance to save her and her puppies? The road was treacherous, and the snow showed no sign of letting up. Each mile seemed to stretch longer than the last, the darkness closing in with every passing moment. Luna's pain-filled cries echoed in the car, a constant reminder of the stakes. As the stranger's eyes darted back to the road, they couldn't help but think about the moment they first found Luna. Hours earlier, she had been shivering in the snow, her body gaunt and frail from days of scavenging and surviving in the harsh cold. Her belly had been swollen with puppies, but it was clear she hadn't eaten properly in weeks. She had barely been able to stand when they first approached her, but there was something in her eyes that said she wasn't ready to die. Luna had fought against the storm before. She had fought to survive every single day of her life, and now she was fighting for the future of her babies. When the stranger saw her lying there in the snow, shaking and weak, they didn't hesitate. Without thinking, they scooped her up, wrapping her in a blanket to keep her warm. But as they had driven away, their concerns began to grow. Luna's labor had started too early, and the harsh cold outside was only making things worse. The shelter they were heading to was still miles away, but in the dark storm, there was nowhere else they could turn. It was a shelter for strays, a place where dogs like Luna could find safety, warmth, and care. The stranger had heard of it, but never thought they'd need it for something like this. They had hoped the shelter would provide the resources Luna desperately needed, but the storm was a cruel reminder that nature had its own plans. There was no guarantee they would make it in time. The car hit a bump, and Luna cried out, her body tensing in pain. The stranger's heart stopped for a moment as they watched her struggle. They could hear her shallow, labored breathing from the back seat. The fact that Luna was still hanging on, still fighting through each painful contraction, made the stranger wonder just how strong the will to survive truly was. It was as if she understood what was at stake, not just for herself, but for her unborn puppies. Her body was weak from starvation and exhaustion, but her spirit was as fierce as ever. The stranger glanced at her, once more in the rearview mirror, their minds spinning with worries. Luna's body seemed to tremble harder with each passing second, and they couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could she endure this torment? How long before her strength gave out? And how much longer before she would need the help that was still miles away? The storm outside roared louder, the wind pressing against the windows as though it were trying to break in. The roads were becoming more dangerous, and the headlights barely pierced the heavy snowfall. The stranger's grip on the wheel tightened, knowing that every second counted. They couldn't afford to waste time, not with Luna's life, and the lives of her puppies, hanging in the balance. But even as the storm threatened to overtake them, Luna's spirit refused to waver. She gave another painful cry, but instead of surrendering to the overwhelming agony, she fought through it. Her eyes met the stranger's again through the rearview mirror, and the silent message was clear. She wasn't giving up. She couldn't. Not yet. The car slid slightly on a patch of ice, but the stranger's instinct took over. With a sharp turn of the wheel, they regained control. Every movement, every decision felt crucial. They couldn't afford to let the storm claim Luna now, not when they were so close to safety. The snow continued to fall heavily, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were still on the road. Luna was still breathing. She was still fighting. And as the storm raged on, the stranger did the only thing they could, kept driving, never slowing down, never giving up. The storm had no mercy. It seemed as though the very elements were against them, as the bitter wind battered the car, making it shake and creak under the pressure. Inside, the car was a fragile sanctuary for Luna and the stranger, who were both fighting against time and the unforgiving weather. Luna's body trembled with each wave of pain, her contractions growing stronger, more frequent, as if each one was a cruel reminder of how close she was to giving birth in the most desperate of circumstances. Luna's eyes, though filled with exhaustion, never lost that spark of resilience. The stranger could see it, the mother's desperate will to survive, to protect her unborn puppies. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body shivering from both the cold and the intensity of labor. The stranger's heart ached as they looked back at the dog, her body curled into a tight ball on the back seat. The wind howled outside, the snowflakes slamming against the windows, but inside the car, it was as if the world had slowed down, leaving only Luna's pain, the stranger's anxiety, and the urgency to reach the shelter. The shelter was still miles away, but it was the only hope for Luna and her puppies. The stranger could feel the weight of that knowledge pressing down on their chest. Each minute seemed to stretch into an eternity. Luna's pain was palpable, each contraction pulling her closer to the brink. But somehow she kept fighting. There was no other choice. There was no other place to turn. Luna's struggles were heart-wrenching. She was already exhausted from the hardship of life on the streets, from the constant battle against hunger, cold, and fear. Now, her body was enduring the extreme pain of labor, and yet, she was still trying to hold on, still fighting for her unborn puppies. The stranger, despite their fear, couldn't help but admire her strength. It was a strength born from survival, from an unrelenting desire to protect the fragile lives growing inside her. And the stranger couldn't give up on her, not now. The car slid dangerously on the icy road, and the stranger's hands gripped the wheel with a white-knuckled intensity. They couldn't afford to lose control, not now. The road was treacherous, and each turn felt like a gamble. The snow fell faster now, and the visibility was almost non-existent. The stranger could barely make out the outline of the road ahead, but they kept going, pushing through the storm, knowing that every second counted. Luna was so close to safety, so close to a chance at life for herself and her puppies. With every mile that passed, the shelter seemed to be an impossible dream. Luna's labor was getting worse, and the stranger could feel the panic rising in their chest. They were running out of time, and the storm seemed to be only intensifying. The weather was relentless, and the car's headlights barely illuminated the way forward. The stranger had no idea how much farther they had to go, but they couldn't afford to stop. Luna's whimpers echoed in the car, a constant reminder of the urgency, of the fight they were both in. Suddenly, Luna cried out, a sharp, painful sound that made the stranger flinch. It was as if her body was telling them that she could go no further, that she needed help, that she needed safety now. The stranger's heart pounded, and they glanced back at Luna, their anxiety growing. The dog's body trembled uncontrollably, and her breaths were coming faster now, shallow gasps mixed with soft whimpers. The contraction was so intense that Luna's entire body stiffened, her face contorted with pain. It was as if the world was closing in on them. Everything was dark, the storm outside, the car's cramped interior, and Luna's agony, all blending into a terrifying blur. "Come on, Luna. Just hold on a little longer," the stranger whispered, though they knew she couldn't understand their words. It was more of a desperate plea, a hope that their voice would somehow soothe her, that it would give her the strength to keep going just a little longer. The car skidded again on the icy road, the tires slipping on the slick surface. The stranger's grip on the steering wheel tightened, their knuckles white, but they didn't dare take their eyes off the road. Luna's cries grew louder, more insistent, and the stranger could feel their own chest tighten with fear. There was no choice but to push forward. Each mile seemed to stretch on endlessly. The snowflakes danced in the headlights, a swirling vortex that obscured everything around them. The wind howled outside, its icy fingers creeping through the cracks in the car. But still, Luna fought on. Despite her pain, despite the growing exhaustion, she was still clinging to the hope that help was coming, that safety was just around the corner. She hadn't given up, and neither could the stranger. Luna's eyes fluttered, and for a moment, the stranger thought she might pass out from the sheer pain. But then, with a sudden gasp, Luna's body tensed again. The contraction was strong, so much stronger than the others. The stranger held their breath, eyes wide with fear and concern. They had to get to the shelter. They had to save her. The storm raged outside, but the stranger refused to let it defeat them. The shelter was too close now, too close for them to fail. They gripped the wheel tighter, their heart racing as they navigated the icy road. They could see the shelter's faint outline in the distance, just a few more turns away. But Luna's body was trembling, her cries coming in waves, and the stranger knew that they had to act fast. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. Luna needed help now. As they approached the shelter, the storm finally seemed to calm, the wind dying down, and the snow slowing to a gentle flurry. But Luna's struggle was far from over. The stranger knew they had to get her inside quickly, but the uncertainty of the road ahead still loomed large in their mind. The shelter was in sight. They were so close. The car screeched to a halt just outside the shelter, tires crunching against the snow. The cold was brutal, the wind howling through every crack in the car's windows, but there was no time to waste. The stranger's heart pounded in their chest as they grabbed the door handle, their breath visible in the freezing air. The shelter was within reach, but Luna's condition was deteriorating fast. They hurried to the back seat, where Luna lay trembling. Her body was stiff with exhaustion, her breathing shallow, but she managed a weak whimper as the stranger touched her. Luna's pain was palpable, but there was something in her eyes, a silent plea for help. The stranger, shaking with fear and cold, carefully lifted Luna from the car. The storm raged around them, but they pushed forward. With Luna cradled in their arms, the stranger stumbled toward the shelter's door, pushing through the harsh wind. The building's warmth hit them like a wave as they entered, the stark contrast to the outside world almost overwhelming. The stranger rushed to the nearest bed, gently placing Luna down as she let out a soft whimper. The shelter workers rushed over, assessing Luna's condition. One woman, her hands gentle but swift, began to calm Luna, speaking softly to her, assuring her she was safe. "You've made it. You're going to be okay," she whispered, and Luna's eyes flickered with something like relief. The stranger stood by, unable to focus on anything except Luna's pain and the struggle of her labor. The shelter workers worked quickly to get things ready for the birth, checking on Luna's condition and preparing for the delivery. As Luna's contractions became more frequent, her cries grew louder, and the stranger, overcome with emotion, remained by her side, offering what comfort they could. The first puppy arrived, fragile and small. Luna licked the newborn pup, nudging it gently with her nose, a soft whimper escaping her as she gazed at the tiny life in front of her. The stranger felt tears stinging their eyes as they watched the miracle unfold before them. Despite all the suffering Luna had endured, she had made it. Her pups were finally safe. As each of Luna's puppies arrived, the shelter workers carefully cleaned them and placed them near their mother. Luna, though exhausted, nuzzled each one lovingly, as if instinctively knowing her role as their protector. Her breathing, now steady but labored, was a quiet testament to the battle she had fought to survive. She had pushed through the cold, the hunger, and the pain. And now, she was surrounded by her puppies, safe, warm, and loved. The stranger stood back for a moment, the weight of the journey hitting them all at once. Luna had made it. She had fought through the harshest of circumstances, and now her family, her new life, was here. In that moment, the stranger realized that this was not just a rescue. It was a rebirth. Luna, though battered and scarred, had found a way to heal. The shelter was warm, a welcome refuge from a storm that continued to rage outside. But within, there was an undercurrent of tension. Luna, though no longer in immediate danger from the harsh cold, was far from out of the woods. Her body trembled with exhaustion, a silent testament to the battle she had fought, her limbs sore, her spirit fatigued. The journey that had brought her here, to safety had been long, but the road to true recovery was just beginning. The stranger remained by her side, their hands constantly brushing against her fur, offering as much comfort as they could. But there was little they could do to erase the physical strain Luna had endured. She lay on the bed, her body stiff and weak, only managing the faintest of movements to adjust her position as she tried to rest. Despite everything, her eyes never left her newborn pups. There was an undeniable protective instinct that guided her, a raw and primal force that kept her alert even in her weariness. Her puppies, small and fragile, wriggled beside her, their cries weak, but filled with a sense of life, of hope. Luna's tired eyes softened as she nuzzled them, licking their tiny faces with what little strength she had left. Each movement she made was slow, deliberate, as though she were trying to conserve the small reserves of energy she had left. She had to be strong for them. There was no other option. They depended on her. As the hours ticked by, Luna's body remained tense. Her labored breathing was a constant reminder of how much pain she had endured. The stranger could see that Luna's exhaustion wasn't just physical. It was emotional, too. Luna had fought not only for her own survival, but for the survival of her pups. And in that fight, her strength had been tested in ways that no one could have imagined. The harsh cold, the hunger, the hours of labor, it had all taken its toll on her. Yet, despite it all, there was a quiet resilience that refused to die. Luna was a fighter, and she was determined to protect her pups, no matter the cost. The shelter staff worked in the background, monitoring Luna's progress, making sure she had everything she needed. They administered fluids, checking her temperature, and ensuring her body could handle the trauma. The physical wounds were healing, but there were deeper scars, scars of trauma and fear. The shelter workers knew that even though Luna had survived the most intense moments, the danger wasn't over. There was still the possibility of infection, of complications arising from her difficult labor. They could only hope that Luna's strength would be enough. Meanwhile, the stranger couldn't help but think back to everything Luna had been through. They had found her in the cold, shivering on the streets, her body barely holding on to life. They had pulled her into the warmth, into the shelter of the unknown, and fought for her survival as she had fought for her pups. It felt like an eternity ago. Now, Luna lay in front of them, vulnerable but alive, and for the first time, the stranger felt a sense of peace. They had done all they could, but they knew the real test of survival was in the days to come. Luna needed time. Time to heal. Time to rest. And so, the stranger stayed close, never leaving her side, whispering words of comfort, even though they knew she couldn't hear them. But the stranger's presence was a promise, a silent vow that Luna and her pups would never be alone again. In this moment, they had become her family, her protectors, her lifeline. The hours stretched into the night, and Luna's breathing began to steady. The pain of labor, the exhaustion that had plagued her, was starting to lessen. The puppies, still weak but more active, clung to her warmth. Luna's eyes remained open, fixed on them. She was still so fragile, but she was determined. Her body had been through the worst. And now, with her pups safe, she could rest, for just a little while. The night stretched on, but in the shelter, time seemed to slow down. The warmth from the heating system was a stark contrast to the fierce winds still howling outside. Every now and then, the walls of the shelter would groan under the pressure of the storm, but inside, the air was calm. Luna remained still, her breathing steadying, though her body still shuddered from the lingering trauma. The puppies, nestled around her, continued to nurse, their tiny bodies clinging to the warmth of their mother's fur. The stranger was still there, sitting quietly beside Luna. They didn't speak much, allowing the soft sounds of the puppies' mewls and the occasional rustling of blankets to fill the space. They didn't know how much longer they would have to stay there, but one thing was certain. They would not leave until Luna was out of danger. The bond between them and Luna had grown since that first moment of contact on the streets. What had started as an act of compassion had transformed into something far deeper, a quiet promise to protect. For Luna, the night was a restless one. Despite the safety of the shelter, her mind was not at ease. She could still feel the weight of the cold, the harshness of the streets where she had been wandering alone, the biting wind that had clawed at her skin. Her body was sore, stiff from the trauma, and her muscles ached as though they had been put through a never-ending battle. But now, her focus was entirely on her pups. The pain in her body was secondary to their survival. She had made it through the worst of it. The pups needed her. She could not let them down. The stranger kept an eye on Luna, knowing the danger wasn't over. It was hard to imagine that Luna had come so close to death just hours earlier. They had been prepared for the worst, but Luna had defied the odds. There was a strength within her that was undeniable. But as the hours passed, the stranger noticed a change in Luna's eyes. They were still filled with the raw, protective instinct of a mother, but now there was something else, something like quiet gratitude. Luna was still a warrior, but for the first time since she had been found, she seemed to relax, if only for a moment. The puppies were no longer as weak as they had been earlier. They had started to latch on to their mother with more strength, their tiny mouths pressing against her skin as they fought for the nourishment they needed. Luna's tail twitched with every movement of the puppies. She licked them with a tenderness that contrasted the brutal conditions she had once faced. Each little one clung to her desperately, the warmth of her body the only comfort they had ever known. The stranger stood up, walking to the far side of the room to give Luna some space. They looked out of the window, watching the snowflakes fall softly to the ground, a stark contrast to the violence of the storm that had raged through the night. The outside world seemed so far away now. Here, in the quiet of the shelter, it was as though everything had come to a standstill. The uncertainty of the world outside could not touch them in this moment. The shelter workers continued to monitor Luna's condition, checking on her vital signs, making sure the new mother had everything she needed to stay healthy. They had stabilized her temperature, given her fluids, and provided nutrients to help restore her energy. But the fight was far from over. Her body had been through so much, and they knew that infections were a constant threat after such an ordeal. Luna's chances of surviving the next few days depended on how well her body could recover, how strong her will to live was. The stranger returned to Luna's side, their hand gently resting on her back. Luna turned her head slightly, acknowledging their presence, her eyes flickering with gratitude. It was as if she understood that they were doing everything in their power to keep her and her pups safe. The stranger wasn't sure if Luna knew just how much they cared for her. They had never expected to form such a deep connection with a dog in need. But here they were, sharing in the quiet moments of recovery, each one holding the promise of a brighter future. Luna shifted, moving slightly to adjust her position so that she could better protect her pups. It was a slow, deliberate movement, as though her body was protesting against the effort. But she did it anyway, pushing through the pain to make sure her babies were secure. They were still so small, so fragile. Every tiny whimper they made filled Luna with a fierce determination to ensure they would grow strong and healthy. The stranger watched this exchange in awe, marveling at the strength of this mother. It was a raw, unspoken bond that transcended words. In that moment, it was clear that Luna had given everything for her pups, and now it was their turn to give everything for her. The hours seemed to pass slowly, but Luna's recovery was happening. Her breaths had deepened, becoming slower and more rhythmic. Her eyes remained fixed on her pups, but there was a quiet steadiness to her now. It was as if the worst was finally behind them. Her body was still weak, but her spirit was indomitable. Luna had fought so hard to keep herself and her pups alive on the streets. Now, she had a chance to heal, to grow stronger. The stranger sat quietly, watching over Luna and her pups. They knew the road ahead would be long, but they also knew that Luna had proven she could survive anything. She had made it through the most brutal storm of her life, and now, with the warmth of the shelter and the safety of her pups, she had the opportunity to thrive. But this fight, the fight for survival, was not over. It would be months before Luna could fully recover, before her pups would be strong enough to stand on their own. Yet, as the stranger sat there, watching Luna protect her newborns, they felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time in a long while, they felt hopeful. Luna's fight was not just hers anymore. It was their fight, too, and they would do everything in their power to ensure she and her pups had the life they deserved. The first light of morning crept in through the window, casting a soft glow over the shelter. The storm had finally passed, but its effects lingered. Outside, the streets were buried beneath a thick layer of snow, the world still and quiet. Inside, however, there was a sense of cautious optimism. Luna's breathing had steadied overnight, and the puppies, though fragile, had continued to nurse from their mother. The warmth of the shelter was a comfort they had never known before, and it seemed to be slowly working its magic on them. Luna stirred slightly, her head lifting as she glanced around. She was still exhausted, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes, a sign that she was slowly reclaiming her power. Her pups remained nestled close to her, their tiny bodies twitching in their sleep. They were safe, and for the first time in days, Luna allowed herself to rest fully, knowing that they were no longer alone in the cold, unforgiving world. The stranger was sitting nearby, their eyes fixed on the little family. It was hard to believe how much had changed in such a short time. Luna had gone from wandering the streets, searching for a place to survive, to finding warmth and safety. The stranger had been there for every step of the journey, offering comfort when Luna needed it most. They had promised to protect her, and now, as Luna lay recovering with her pups, the stranger was filled with an overwhelming sense of relief. Still, there was no denying the challenges that lay ahead. Luna was far from fully recovered. Her body had endured so much over the past few days, and her strength was still fragile. The puppies, while thriving, were still vulnerable. There was a long road ahead, filled with uncertainties and risks. The stranger knew that they couldn't afford to let their guard down. Luna needed constant care, and the puppies would need everything they could give to ensure they grew strong and healthy. The shelter workers came in quietly, checking on Luna and her pups. They whispered among themselves, their voices full of concern but also hope. Luna had made it through the worst, but the journey was far from over. The pups were doing well, but they were still so small, their tiny bodies fragile and dependent on their mother. The workers offered more food and water for Luna, as well as additional care to help support her recovery. For the stranger, it was a moment of reflection. They had seen so many animals in need, but this situation felt different. There was something about Luna's determination to survive, her relentless drive to protect her pups, that had touched them deeply. It was a bond that had formed in the most unlikely of circumstances, and they knew they couldn't walk away now. They had made a promise to Luna, and they intended to keep it. The days that followed were filled with small victories. Luna began to eat more, her body slowly regaining strength. The puppies, too, were becoming stronger, their cries growing louder as they fought for their share of their mother's nourishment. It was a beautiful, if exhausting, sight to see. Every time the puppy squirmed or stretched, it was a reminder of how fragile life could be and how hard it was to survive in a world that didn't always offer help. But Luna was no longer alone. She had found her refuge, a place where she could heal and care for her pups in safety. The stranger continued to visit daily, offering comfort and care. They had made sure that Luna had everything she needed to thrive, and as the days passed, it became clear that Luna's journey was far from over. Though the storm had passed, Luna's fight was not yet won. But as she lay there with her pups, her head held high and her body slowly regaining strength, it was impossible to ignore the incredible journey she had already made. From the frozen streets to the warmth of the shelter, Luna had fought for survival in ways that no one could have imagined. And as the stranger watched over her, they knew that they, too, had become a part of her story. A story of survival, resilience, and the deep, unspoken bond between a mother and her pups. This was only the beginning. The air was colder than it had been in days, a biting chill that slipped under the door and pressed against Luna's fragile body. She lay curled up beside her pups, her eyes half closed, as though she had resigned herself to the exhausting reality of life. It had been weeks since she had found her refuge, but this was not a time for celebration. The road to recovery had been long, and even though she had come so far, Luna could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her like a looming storm. The pups were growing stronger, but she knew their survival depended on more than just shelter and warmth. It required something deeper, something that she had to give more of. The stranger, though still a constant presence in her life, had begun to see the cracks in the facade that Luna had carefully built. The initial relief of finding safety had worn off, replaced by the relentless grind of recovery, and the pressure had begun to mount. It was clear that Luna wasn't out of danger yet. She was fighting not just for herself, but for her puppies, and that kind of pressure could break even the strongest spirit. She had fought to keep them alive on the streets, but now, in this sterile space, surrounded by people who were doing everything they could to help, it felt as if her strength was being stretched thinner with every passing moment. The stranger stood silently in the corner of the room, watching Luna as she struggled to catch her breath. They could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her once strong frame trembled with every breath. Luna had given everything to her pups, and now the toll of that sacrifice was evident. She wasn't as young as she once was, and her body had been through so much. The stranger could feel the knot in their stomach tighten. They had promised to protect Luna and her pups, but there were limits to what even the best care could do, and that realization was harder to face than they ever could have anticipated. The shelter workers had been keeping a close eye on Luna's condition, but the truth was that no one had a clear answer. Luna had shown resilience beyond measure, but her body was fighting against forces beyond anyone's control. The puppies, too, had become a source of concern. While they were growing stronger every day, they were still so tiny, so fragile. The odds were stacked against them, and there was a growing sense of uncertainty hanging over the shelter like a dark cloud. The moment of truth had arrived, and the question that loomed in the air was simple yet impossible to answer. How much longer could Luna keep fighting? The stranger moved closer to Luna, kneeling down beside her. Her eyes flickered open, and for a moment, the two locked gazes. There was no need for words. In that silent exchange, Luna communicated everything she had been through: her fear, her exhaustion, her unwavering love for her pups. She had fought to protect them from the cold, from the world, from everything that threatened to tear them apart. But now she needed help, and though it was hard for her to admit, Luna knew that even the strongest hearts had their limits. The stranger reached out, gently stroking her fur, offering what little comfort they could. It wasn't enough. Nothing was ever enough when it came to this fight. But in that moment, something shifted in the air. The stranger realized, with a painful clarity, that this was no longer just about survival. It was about hope. Hope that they could do enough to save her, enough to save the pups. Hope that Luna could hang on just a little longer, that she could make it through this trial. A quiet sob escaped the stranger's throat. There was no shame in it. There was only raw, unfiltered emotion, the kind that could only come from seeing a creature, who had already given everything, teeter on the edge of surrender. They whispered softly to Luna, promising her that they would fight with her until the very end. But deep down, they feared that no matter how much love and care they offered, there might not be enough time. The shelter workers, too, felt the weight of the situation. They were doing everything in their power to keep Luna stable, but the progress was slow. Her strength had been spent on the journey here, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead seemed insurmountable. Yet, they continued to offer their support, knowing that any moment could tip the balance in Luna's favor, or that it could tip the other way. There was nothing more they could do now but wait. As the hours passed, Luna remained in the same position, her body curled protectively around her pups. They could hear the faint sound of their tiny whimpers, the unmistakable noise of life, fighting to continue, even in the harshest of circumstances. It was a sound that filled the room with both hope and dread, the realization that even in the darkest moments, life would not let go easily. The room was filled with a tense stillness, broken only by the faint sounds of Luna's shallow breathing and the distant hum of the shelter's heating system. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, the battle was quieter, more intimate. Luna's body trembled, not from the cold, but from the weight of the situation. The stranger could not bear to leave her side, and neither could the workers who had come to care for her. They had seen many dogs in distress, but something about Luna's condition struck a chord deep within them all. She wasn't just any animal. She was a symbol of resilience, of survival against impossible odds. The puppies stirred beside her, their tiny bodies pressing against her for warmth, unaware of the battle taking place around them. Luna's protective instinct had not wavered for a second. She continued to shield them, even as she struggled to maintain her own strength. It was clear that her body was giving out, but she clung to the one thing that mattered most, her love for her pups. The stranger's heart ached as they watched the scene unfold before them. They wanted to do more, to offer more than just their presence, but it felt as though they were helpless in the face of something beyond their control. As time passed, the situation became increasingly dire. Luna's condition had not improved, and her energy was rapidly fading. The strangers and the shelter workers exchanged worried glances, unable to find a way to turn the tide. They knew that Luna needed more than just medical attention. She needed hope, something they could not provide. And yet, despite the grim reality of the situation, there was still a flicker of something, a spark of determination that refused to be extinguished. Luna's eyes met the strangers once again. In that moment, there was a profound connection. It was as though Luna, exhausted as she was speaking directly to them without words. She had fought for so long, given so much, and now it was time to decide. Would she be able to pull through, or had she reached her limit? With a shaky breath, the stranger gently reached for Luna's paw, holding it in their hand, offering her the comfort she so desperately needed. A tear slipped down their face as they whispered, "You are not alone. We will fight for you, Luna, no matter what happens." At that moment, Luna's breathing steadied, if only for a moment. The stranger's words had reached her, and though the battle was far from over, she felt the strength of their bond. Luna's love for her puppies had carried her through so much already, but now it was this connection, this promise of unwavering support, that gave her the courage to keep going. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, a small glimmer of hope had taken root. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in the quiet of that room, as Luna lay with her pups beside her, the stranger could not help but hold on to the belief that, no matter how difficult the road ahead might be, they would not give up. For Luna, for her puppies, they would continue to fight. It was the faintest shift, almost imperceptible to anyone but the most observant. A glimmer of hope that began to rise, as fragile as the early morning light creeping through the shelter's windows. Luna's breaths, though still labored, seemed to deepen with a quiet sense of resilience. The danger had not passed, but something had shifted within her, something that whispered of endurance, of not giving up yet. The shelter workers, who had been anxiously watching her every move, held their breath. They had seen many animals in peril, many whose bodies failed them under the stress of life, but Luna was different. Her spirit had always been one of defiance. She had fought through the cold streets, protected her puppies with nothing but her own body, and made it this far. No matter how much the odds had stacked against her, Luna refused to let go of what mattered most, the tiny lives that still clung to her for warmth, safety, and love. The stranger, still holding Luna's paw, felt the change as well. There was no dramatic shift, no sudden recovery, but in that small change, there was a profound transformation. The stranger could see it in Luna's eyes, an unspoken promise that she was not ready to give up, that she still had fight left in her. That quiet, steady resolve spoke volumes, and it gave the stranger the strength to hold on just a little longer. In the corner of the room, one of the shelter workers gently approached, offering a soft smile. "We may have turned a corner," they said quietly, "but she'll need all the support we can give her." The stranger nodded, though their mind was still racing. Luna's condition was far from stable, and the battle was far from over. Yet, the small spark of hope that had ignited in that room, like a flicker of light in the darkest night, was enough to push them forward. It was the fuel they needed to keep fighting, not just for Luna, but for her puppies too. They had come so far, and now, at this critical moment, they were no longer just passengers in Luna's fight for survival. They were active participants in her journey toward healing. As the hours passed, the changes, though subtle, became more noticeable. Luna's energy seemed to be returning in small bursts. She was still weak, still fragile, but her will was unbroken. The shelter workers continued their efforts, providing the medical care she needed, while the stranger kept watch over her, refusing to leave her side. The puppies, too, were beginning to show signs of improvement. Their tiny bodies wriggled and stretched, their tiny paws finding their way toward Luna's warmth. Luna's protective instincts, though weary, remained intact. She nuzzled each of them gently, her body curling around them as if to shield them from the world. The stranger marveled at the quiet strength Luna exuded, even as she fought against her own body's limitations. By the time night fell again, the tension in the room had lessened. It wasn't that Luna had miraculously recovered. It was more that the worst seemed to have passed. Her condition was still touch and go, but she had pulled through the most dangerous part. The stranger let out a long, silent breath, feeling the weight of the uncertainty lift, even if only for a moment. The shelter's dim lights cast a soft glow over the room, a calming contrast to the frigid world outside. The howling winds and blinding snowstorm had been relentless, but here, within the warmth of the shelter, Luna had found a brief respite. It was not much, but it was enough to give her the energy to begin the long process of healing. Luna's eyes fluttered open again. The world still seemed hazy to her, and her body felt heavy, as though it carried the weight of everything she had endured. But there was something different now. Something had changed, and it wasn't just her physical condition. It was a shift in the air, in the energy that filled the room. The stranger, sitting beside her, was still there, their eyes locked on her with a tenderness that spoke volumes. For the first time, Luna noticed how gentle their touch was, the way they caressed her fur with reverence, as though she were something sacred. She couldn't fully understand the depth of their devotion, but she could feel it. The stranger whispered softly, their voice barely above a murmur. "You're doing great, Luna. You're so strong. Just a little longer." Luna's ears twitched slightly, the sound of their voice grounding her, calming her. She shifted a little, trying to adjust her position to rest more comfortably against the blankets that had been carefully arranged around her. The pups, still curled up beside her, squirmed a little as they nuzzled into her warmth. They were small, fragile, but they were fighting. Luna's heart swelled with pride for them, for the way they had clung to life in the harshest of conditions. And now, Luna had a chance to give them a future that seemed impossible just a short time ago. The shelter workers continued to monitor her condition, carefully checking her vitals and offering her small doses of nutrition. It wasn't easy, and it would take time, but Luna's resolve was undeniable. Every moment, she seemed to regain a little more strength, a little more focus. The stranger stayed by her side, offering words of encouragement, their presence a quiet but constant reassurance. As the days passed, Luna's transformation became even more apparent. She was still weak, still far from being fully recovered, but there was a quiet determination that emanated from her. It wasn't just the physical healing that was happening. It was the emotional recovery, too. Luna had suffered so much, lost so much, but here, surrounded by those who cared for her, she began to understand that she was not alone. She was part of something greater now, part of a community that refused to give up on her, and that made all the difference. The stranger, too, was beginning to heal. The weight of the uncertainty had lifted, and though Luna's recovery was still fragile, the stranger felt a deep sense of relief. They had come into this situation with nothing but their own will to help, unsure of what they could offer. But now, looking at Luna and her puppies, they knew that this was the moment they had been waiting for. It was the moment when hope and action collided, when the effort to save a life was met with the undeniable power of love and compassion. Days turned into weeks, and Luna's condition continued to improve. She regained her appetite, her strength, and most importantly, her trust in those around her. The puppies, too, grew stronger, their tiny bodies becoming more robust with each passing day. Luna, always the protective mother, watched over them with a fierce devotion, her eyes never straying far from them. She had given everything to get to this point, and now she would do whatever it took to ensure their survival. The stranger's role in Luna's recovery was undeniable. They had been there from the beginning, offering support when it was needed most. They had witnessed Luna's journey from the brink of despair to the cusp of a new beginning, and they were not about to leave now. Their bond with Luna had deepened in ways they hadn't expected. What started as an act of kindness had evolved into something far more profound. They were no longer just a stranger, they were family. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the shelter. Luna stood up on her own for the first time since her arrival. Her legs were wobbly, and she leaned heavily on the shelter's walls, but she stood. The stranger watched in awe, a tear slipping down their cheek as they saw Luna take that first step. It was a symbol of her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering determination to survive. She had fought through the storm, and now she was standing tall. Luna's journey was far from over. There were still challenges to face, still obstacles in the path ahead. But in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the shelter, the love of her puppies, and the unwavering support of the stranger, Luna knew that she had overcome the worst. The storm had passed, and though the road ahead would not always be easy, she was no longer alone. As Luna took another tentative step, the stranger knelt beside her, their voice full of emotion. "You did it, Luna. You've made it through the hardest part." Luna's eyes, filled with gratitude and strength, met theirs. It was a silent promise. She would keep fighting, not just for herself, but for the tiny lives she carried. The puppies stirred next to her, each one finding their way to their mother's warmth once more. They were safe now, and Luna had become the living proof of resilience, the embodiment of a journey from despair to hope, from frozen streets to burning hearts. The journey of Luna and her puppies is more than just a story of survival. It is a testament to the incredible power of hope, compassion, and resilience. As Luna's path unfolds, she reminds us that even in the harshest conditions, there is always a chance for redemption, for healing, and for love to find its way. But the journey does not end here. The battle for the safety and well-being of animals like Luna is ongoing, and it requires all of us to make a difference. We can help by supporting shelters, rescues, and organizations that provide vital care and protection for animals in need. Every donation, every share, and every kind word helps to create a world where stories like Luna's are no longer the norm but the exception. If Luna's story moved you, share it with others. Encourage them to get involved and make a change. Whether through fostering, volunteering, or simply spreading awareness, we can all play a part in giving animals the life they deserve. Join us in the fight for a brighter future for all animals. Like, comment, and share this story to inspire others. Together, we can continue making a difference, one paw at a time.